I'll give a perfect hello, everyone. I will give a quick little introduction. My name is Maddie Fawnline. I work as the Northern Regional Organizer and Ely office coordinator for the campaign to save the boundary waters. And this is where I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So Save the Boundary Waters is a fairly large name. I'm sure most of you have probably heard of us in some context or another. We've been around since 2013 when we first got started. But a lot of people don't know that the campaign to save the boundary waters is exactly that, a campaign, which was started by Northeastern Minnesotans for Wilderness. So that's the parent organization who I work for. Northeastern Minnesotans for Wilderness is leading the efforts to permanently protect the boundary waters as well as the Rainy River watershed, which I will elaborate upon more in this presentation. But Northeastern Minnesotans for Wilderness, NMW as we usually call them, run a number of different programs out of Ely, Minnesota. And so the big one is Save the Boundary Waters, but another one is Kids for the Boundary Waters, a similar organization that was started by a kid who is about my age now. That was a couple of years ago. And so really the purpose of Kids for the Boundary Waters is to get kids involved and connected with not only wilderness, but lobbying and advocating for wild spaces. So the big project that Kids for the Boundary Waters does every year is they fly into Washington, D.C. with about 30 or so, 12 to 23-year-olds who talk with their elected officials and other members from various agencies in the government. One of the other programs that we run is the Boundary Waters Business Coalition. We have about 400 businesses and organizations that have signed on in support of protecting the boundary waters, many of them from around the Arrowhead region, so up here with me in Ely, and many of them are also national names too, Patagonia, North Face, folks like those. And one of our other programs that we do that is doing phenomenal work up here is Boundary Waters Connect. That's an economic community development project, really trying to bolster healthy relationships between one another in the community, as well as this real difficult thing you have in any tourist town, the tourists versus the locals, and making sure local folks are getting what they need out of the community, but also still being a welcoming and inviting space for tourists to potentially become locals. So that's just a little bit about NMW. One of our big goals is really a permanent ban on sulfide-ore mining in the watershed of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. And that extends out to just general protection for the wilderness. We're also in strong favor of making sure campsites aren't too impacted by humans, and making sure that in general we're being good stewards of the wilderness and these phenomenal public lands we have up here. I'll talk just a little bit about our approach. So NMW, our parent organization, has been around since 1993. The campaign has been around since about 2012, 2013. And one of the biggest things that our organization really engages in is engagement and awareness. So although we kind of function as a national organization, we also have very strong roots to Ely, Minnesota in this local region. But wilderness and public lands themselves are owned by everyone across the United States. And so we have been really working with people and trying to bolster this idea that just because it's in Minnesota doesn't mean it's only for Minnesotans. It's for everyone across the country and across the world. And so we really try to engage in education and awareness in broad communities across the country. And an example of education and awareness is something like this presentation. I do outreach, so I love talking to people about the boundary waters. Some of the other big things that we do is science and litigation. So we do water quality monitoring in some of these areas just to get baseline impairment levels and really see what's going on in the environment that perhaps other organizations don't have capacity to do. Of course, anytime you talk about environmental works, there's always some form of litigation that happens. So that's a big part of our organization too. I mentioned this previously, but our business coalition, over 400 businesses and organizations support us. That's super critical because they really help spread the word and really help connect people to our organization. Just the other day, I had a young woman call me who was doing a school project, and she had gone on a canoe trip with one of our business partners, Hungry Jack Outfitters. and he referred her to me. And that was just so cool. It's like, yeah, the system is working. So our business partners and other organizations are so invaluable. And the last big thing we do is political advocacy. And I'll chat about this a little bit at the end, but we've been working at the state and federal level to get some permanent bills passed. Permanent bills are really important for this land. It's really one of the only ways to get effective permanent protection for the boundary waters. So I'll pause there. I see something popped up in the chat. Okay. If anybody has any questions, of course, please feel free to put them in the chat. I am good to just kind of pause and answer anything as they come up. So who am I? Let me talk a little bit more about myself. I am the organizer and headquarters coordinator, but prior to getting involved with the campaign to save the boundary waters, I was a canoe guide for, gosh, like 6 summer seasons. So I worked for the Northern Lakes Girl Scout Canoe Base based up here in Ely, Minnesota. And that's kind of how I got my start in all of this. Although I'm very canoe passionate, I'm actually from Colorado. So I went on a trip, Boundary Waters trip when I was 15 and just really ended up falling in love with this region and couldn't quite get enough. So I kept coming back. I was a guide from 2017 to 2019 for the Girl Scout base. Took a lovely COVID hiatus, as many people had to that summer, and then came back in summer of 21 to work for another outfitter. So I have a pretty big background in guiding youth through the wilderness. And one of my favorite parts about the Girl Scout base is it was incredibly diverse in its background. We brought a lot of people from different areas across the country, and particularly LGBTQIA youth, which was always my favorite part. So I'll talk about this later, but having communication with people in a wilderness setting, who have been really deeply impacted by the wilderness, just say some of the most like wholesome or like just really heart-wrenching stuff. So I love getting people out into the woods. It's one of the biggest things that I want to focus my life on. All right. So before I get too far and be too presumptuous, let's talk a little bit about what the Boundary Waters is. So many people know about it. It's the United States' most visited wilderness area with over 165,000 visitors annually. Although in 2020 and 2021, we are seeing upwards of 225,000 visitors annually. So a huge influx in visitation for this wilderness area. But the Boundary Waters Canoe Area, Big W Wilderness, was founded in 1964, 1976, when we had a couple of big wilderness acts come through. But a wilderness is a little bit different from a national park. It doesn't have any roads in it. There's very few man-made structures. And what is man-made is really there to prevent degradation. So if you go on a Boundary Waters trip, you might see fire grates and latrines, and that's really to help minimize human impact on the landscape. Now, the Boundary Waters itself is kind of snuggled right up to the Canadian border, and you'll see in orange the Quetico Provincial Park, so kind of a sister park to the Boundary Waters. But the Boundary Waters is located within the Superior National Forest. So the governing agency that does all the work and maintenance and, if you have to get a permit, all that regulation for the region is the Forest Service within the Superior National Forest. And then just off to the northwest of the Boundary Waters, we have Voyageurs National Park, Minnesota's most wonderful national park. I think it's the only one. So that too is a pretty incredibly diverse area. And this whole thing is 4.3 million acres, and it creates what we call the Superior Quetico-Ecosystem. So a pretty phenomenal area. One thing that I'll point out on this map, we have this blue line, and that blue line is called the Laurentian Divide, and that is a continental divide. So all of the water north of it flows northward up into Voyageurs National Park, and all of the water to the south of this Laurentian Divide flows into Lake Superior. So a big bulk of the water in the Boundary Waters flows northward. All right. A couple more photos. What is the Boundary Waters? It's this incredibly diverse region with a lot of different plants, a lot of different species, very charismatic species like moose and wolf, but also more humble species like monoman, wild rice, lily pads, and turtles. So a pretty cool area. I'll also show this little video of this slug climbing on my water bottle because that was delightful. I went on a trip last September and it rained for 30 hours straight. So the slugs were certainly having a good time. I perhaps was a little soggy and not having the best time, but I'm glad that that little slug could have such an enjoyable moment out in the wilderness. Who uses the boundary waters? The boundary waters has, really traditionally been used by a lot of homogenous populations, so white men going fishing. But in the last couple of years, we've really started to see this shift in boundary waters visitation and usage. We're starting to see more people from diverse backgrounds come up here because it is, one, extremely accessible. Permits only cost about $16 a night, which is really nice. And well, I guess it's not a night, it's per person, excuse me. Getting rental gear is also fairly affordable, and it's in the Midwest. So a lot of the visitation we get are Midwestern people driving to Ely, Minnesota, or Grand Marais, the Gunflint Trail, to go visit the boundary waters. And through recent efforts by our organization and many other organizations to really bolster visitation to the wilderness, we're starting to see this really lovely shift from, these traditional crowds that have used the boundary waters to more quote unquote non-traditional crowds who honestly have been here the whole time, just never get the spotlight. So it's pretty cool to see, who's coming up and using the boundary waters. And one photo I have on here too is dog sledding. The boundary waters is not just a canoe wilderness. There's opportunities for dog sledding, there's opportunities for hiking. There's about more than 100 miles of hiking trails within the wilderness border itself. People can also come up and use motorboats on certain lakes. And so that also increases accessibility for people who may not be able to paddle or portage. And a lot of people who are able-bodied really take that for granted. And so it's great that we can provide this whole plethora of opportunities for a broad spectrum of visitors, which is really important. And that brings me to my next point. The boundary waters is native land, and it always has been. And it currently is protected by the 1854 treaty, so ceded territory for the Anishinaabe. And a couple of things I'll call to attention here. This map was created in partnership with the Boys Fort Band and the Ely Folk School, and it features original Ojibwe names for a lot of the lakes around Lake Vermilion, which is where the Boys Fort Band of Chippewa have their section. And so it's just pretty cool to see, what names used to be and how we kind of have changed, or even how they're like very similar as they once were. So Trout Lake, for example, that is in the boundary waters. There's a number of them on this little section. So if anyone is interested, that's something you can purchase from the folk school or the Boys Fort Band, and it's a really, really cool map. But this is native land. Most wildernesses and most public lands across the nation are or were previously lands of Indigenous peoples. And so I think in my work, I always try to remember that, we call this a wilderness, we call it untracked by man, but it has been a place for people to live in for hundreds of years. And it's been a very loving place to live in too. This is such a just rich area with lots of resources. So, we call it wilderness as if people have never lived there before, but it's, it has an incredibly long history of people living and thriving within the wilderness border. All right, this is where I'm going to get into a little bit of the meat of what our organization is doing. So 4.3 million acres are at risk due to a proposed sulfide-ore copper mine. So Twin Metals Minnesota, that organization, which is owned by Antofagasta, a Chilean mining conglomerate, has come in and proposed this copper nickel mine on one of the major headwaters lakes of the boundary waters. And so our organization back in 2011 saw that they were trying to get some permits renewed to start this project. And that's really when we started to push back and come into this space and say, hey, no, we definitely don't want to risk the boundary waters. This is incredibly important. And that's where hydrology really comes into play. So I talked about the Laurentian Divide a little bit, but the water flow in the boundary waters is pretty cool. So if we imagine the boundary waters, it's like this big sponge. It can hold a lot of water. And when you squeeze the boundary waters, all of that water flows straight into Voyageurs National Park. And so if you remember last year and what we'll likely experience this year, we had a lot of water flowing through the boundary waters. So 2 feet of increased lake capacity in the boundary waters is manageable. That system can handle it. But as soon as it all flows into Crane Lake, you really experience this pretty massive amount of water coming in. And so on Crane Lake, Cabotogama, Namakan, the big lakes in Voyageurs National Park, instead of 2 feet water level rises, it was about 7 to 12. So the Boundary Waters holds a lot of water. So keep an eye out. We're probably going to have experienced some of that flooding again this spring, unfortunately. But the water flow here is incredibly complex, so we have some corridors like up here that just flow along the border, but then down in this region, which is all the Kawishwee River, starting at Kawishwee Lake, flows up, flows down, exits the Boundary Waters at South Kawishwee, enters this lake here, which is Birch Lake and White Iron Lake, then flows back into the Boundary Waters by way of Garden Lake, into Fall Lake, into Crooked Lake, into Lac LaCroix, and then over into Crane Lake and beyond, all the way up to Hudson Bay. So this water is incredibly interconnected within the region, but also connects across this very vast span of North America. And where they've proposed this mine is right here on that major headwaters lake. So to say the least, when our organization caught wind of this plan, we definitely had some major red flags that went up in regards to it, just because it does impact and impair such a vast area of not only the Boundary Waters, but also the Quetico-Superior, the Quetico Provincial Park, Voyageurs National Park, Lake of the Woods, Winnipeg, like all these really major waterways from here north. So that's just a quick lesson on the hydrology of northern Minnesota. Everything south of it flows south. And our organization doesn't work on this necessarily, but if you've heard of the Polymet mine, that's about here, and that would flow south into Lake Superior. So if you want to do more research on that, I definitely encourage it. That's another copper nickel mine. But our organization, in case anybody is wondering, specifically works on the Twin Metals, Minnesota, and Birch Lake mine issues. Here's just a quick visualization of what that path of pollution would look like flowing up into Voyageurs National Park. All right, so let's talk a little bit about sulfide ore. So anytime you mine for copper, nickel, and cobalt, especially in this region, it is incredibly sparse. There's only a little bit of copper, nickel, or cobalt, those usable materials. And so, if you pull out a rock from the ground, 98% of that is waste rock and only 2% of it is usable. So you're imagining just a huge amount of waste rock that has to be processed and dealt with. Across the United States and the world, 100% of copper mines have experienced spills or accidental releases, and that is varying sizes. So a spill could be just a little bit leaking out from like a tailings basin, or it could be like the Gold King mine disaster in Colorado in 2015, which has pretty much completely impaired the Las Animas River near Durango and dumped a lot of, very toxic chemicals into that river, which then made their way to the ocean. So it's pretty devastating. Here's just a quick picture of what a water-rich environment that has the sulfide-bearing or, an acid mine drainage placed into can look like. It has a pretty dramatic effect on a lot of the flora and fauna and just water quality of the lake. So the area that we're talking about up here is the South Kawishwee River. So that's where water comes out of the Boundary Waters, then flows down through here and then generally heads that way. Water from this side of Birch Lake also heads this way. And what we're talking about for this mine is all in here. So this is the Maturi deposit where they'd primarily be doing that mine. Most of that mine is underground, but the really big thing is this black circle here, which is their approximate tailings basin. And that tailings basin that they had proposed previously, I don't know if their plan is going to change in light of a couple of things that have happened recently that I'll elaborate on in just a little bit. But originally they proposed dry stack tailings. So when they mine all of their stuff, they have to separate that copper, nickel, and cobalt away from the waste rock. Then that waste rock gets dried out as much as it can, and it gets stacked on the surface in a dry stack tailings basin. And with these dry stacking basins, there's not really an effective way to cover them. The only thing that they can do is like try to put a basin around it to prevent it from leaching into the lake. And so this map doesn't really show the true scale. So imagine something about 150 feet tall. So 2 white pines stacked on top of each other, and something that's about as wide as 4 malls of America. So it has an incredibly large footprint, and it would just get left there indefinitely. There's no real effective way to remove all of that waste without great cost on either the part of the company or the taxpayers, who would essentially end up, taking the bill for that if something happened. So that tailings basin is really our primary concern. It's about 60 meters away from the water's edge, and it's sandwiched in between 2 creeks. So whenever we do experience high water levels, like we do quite frequently, there is a big concern that something could happen and a lot of that material could get pulled into the lake. Or this is northern Minnesota, it doesn't stay very dry. And so we anticipate that that tailings basin would accumulate precipitation by way of snow or rain that has the potential to flow out into the surrounding ecosystem. So that's our big primary concern with that, is the tailings basin, and then some of the methods that they'd be extracting these resources. So I'm gonna pause there to see if anyone has any questions, but I will say a couple of happy notes. So Twin Metals lost their permit rights. That happened in January of 2022. Secretary Deb Haaland and other members made the decision to cancel some permits that they had obtained during the Trump administration, which were unlawfully renewed. So that was a really big step. And then this January of 2023, Secretary Deb Haaland also enacted a 20-year mining ban for this region, which is absolutely phenomenal. It's the biggest step forward we've had towards permanent protection. And so I just want to have like a quick moment of like celebration that happened. We have been working on that for so long, but we're not done yet. There's always more work to do. There's always more things and ways to get permanent protection for this area. And we're really trying to get bills passed, a state level bill and a federal level bill, to make sure that like no land can be accessed by mining companies and organizations that are trying to come in and jeopardize this very important public space. So some exciting news after all of that kind of sad news. I like to try to balance it out. But this next section of the presentation, I'm really going to talk about the importance of public land and modern times. And to do that, we're going to have a lovely background of an aurora from last year while I talk a little bit. So everyone can just have this nice moment of zen as they watch this beautiful scene. But, in my experience, wilderness really is connection. And it's connection to pretty much everything. It's connection to yourself as you're paddling, as you're portaging, as you're having these experiences in the woods. You're really coming to have this understanding that is very vast. And you really get to know yourself very well, how you're feeling, how you're doing, what's going on in your life. It's all very nice to have that connection to yourself. And another thing is connection to one another. So I've guided a real multitude of youth group trips. Sometimes the kids knew each other, sometimes they didn't. And just having the opportunity to connect with one another, connect with different youth from different backgrounds and different places across the country, has always been one of my highlights of trips. So just having connections with people that you wouldn't normally get to connect with, or, I've taken my mom and her group of lady friends on a trip before, and connecting with them is so fun because they just like, this is totally not something they ever thought they'd be doing in their 50s and 60s. And yet here they are out in the wilderness connecting with themselves and with one another. Another thing, obviously, you're going to connect to nature. You hear loons, you hear trees, you smell all of the lovely smells of the forest, whether it's like the rain or flowers or other scents like that. You really come to appreciate and respect wilderness in this space as its own entity and being, rather than just a place you can visit. So that is one of my favorite parts too. And the final way you connect is with both past travelers, the Anishinaabe, the voyagers who traveled through here, the indigenous peoples who lived and visited the region long before we have really any recollection of, when you go down certain portage trails and when you paddle, what we like to call the border route, you are paddling routes that have been used for thousands of years by people to get from point A to point B. So when you travel in this space, you're connecting with past visitors. And you're also connecting with future visitors who are going to walk where you stepped however long before. And so that's why I find it particularly crucial to get kids and other people really involved in wild spaces because it has such an impact on life. And I'm a huge advocate and proponent for just getting into any outdoor space, even if it's not a big W wilderness or a national park, local parks, community parks, greenways, just like any place you can find nature leads to connection. And like, that's so important. I have said that paddling is like praying for me. When you paddle, when you hike, when you get out into these outdoor spaces, you don't necessarily have to like have a religion you subscribe to, but you feel this spiritual sense of the place, and just paddling is like praying sometimes. We also have connected a lot of people to the wilderness through video, similar to what folks are doing here today. So this is Dave and Amy Freeman. They have done a number of adventure advocacy trips, but the two big ones are Paddle to DC and A Year in the Wilderness. So Dave and Amy spent 365 days living in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, and hundreds of thousands of people from across the world tuned into their social media posts, listened to their blogs, or listened to their podcasts and blogs. And so it was a really huge moment of connection for people who have never been to the wilderness, who have been to the wilderness, people who might never go to the wilderness, but who are just glad it exists, had this opportunity to connect with them. But this canoe that Dave is carrying is one of our famous signature canoes, and we have 4 of them. And it's a huge symbol of connection for people who, might not go to the Boundary Waters, or who might go to the Boundary Waters, to have that opportunity to physically sign a representation of connection is something I think is pretty darn neat. And then I'll talk just a little bit about myself. So wilderness is also an incredible place for healing, whether you're healing from trauma, whether you're healing from an injury, whether you're just like, you just need to get away from work for a weekend and take a breather. It's an incredible space for people. So I think in my own personal life, I've been through some pretty intense experiences, both in the wilderness and just in general. I've been diagnosed with a pretty rare disease that I actually discovered my 2nd or 3rd year as a guide in the wilderness. And I think if I hadn't have had the privilege and the opportunity to connect with these outdoor spaces, I don't know if I personally would be as resilient as I am in my modern state. And so this is just a big advocacy for, wilderness is healing, wilderness is health, especially for people, who just might need a moment to get away from it all. Because when you're out there, you really can, compartmentalize and separate yourself from a lot of, really hard experiences you've had. I've talked to a number of veterans, and this has been remarked many times that, combat veterans and people who have had some pretty intense experiences, go out into wilderness and can just like feel for a moment at least free from a lot of the triggers they experience in modern everyday life. And I also think, having guided kids who have been at risk, having guided with my favorite participant ever was this 50-year-old man who was bringing their gender fluid child on a canoe trip. Combat veteran police sergeant just like broke down in the middle of our trip and just like had this moment of revelation. And it was just so nice to see and have this experience with him and their kid. It was just really cool. So like wilderness is healing, wilderness is health. And, to try to separate or remove people from wild spaces is really a tragedy, and something that needs to be remediated, which brings me to my next topic. Does anyone have any questions before I continue further? All right, not hearing any, but if you do, feel free to reach out. So how is Save the Boundary Waters promoting public health, equity, and access? So I've already talked a lot about just how wilderness existing inherently can bring health, but that doesn't always necessarily mean people are able to easily access it. I'm a strong believer that the Boundary Waters is one of the most incredibly accessible areas in the United States, just because, it's in fairly close proximity to a very large base of people here in the Midwest. Accessing it through permits is, fairly cheap and affordable. Up here, you can rent canoes, so you don't need to have like your own super special equipment. You can just rent it on a day-by-day basis. And that's often far cheaper than, like renting skis. That's kind of how I like to equate it. Like renting a canoe for 4 days is about as expensive as renting a pair of skis or a snowboard for 1 day. So I really think the Boundary Waters is very accessible, but we have to convince people and welcome them in and make sure they feel welcomed in these spaces. So one of the things that we do is promote wilderness visitation and endeavors. So that comes in a multitude of different forms. Perhaps it's creating blog posts and trying to create this space that's welcoming for all people in the Boundary Waters. Perhaps it's things like Dave and Amy's welcome paddle. When they came out of the Year in the Wilderness, there was a huge group of people who came and joined them for the last little section. And, so just introducing people into experiences like that is super important. Perhaps it comes by just showing that you can do more than paddle in the Boundary Waters. You can run, you can hike, you can fish, you can use a motorboat, you can dog sled, you can ski. There's such a vast number of ways to come and visit. You don't just have to do it by canoe. So that's one way that we really want to try to get more people up here, is by expressing that they are welcome and expressing that there are pathways and ways to do it. But sometimes it's really difficult to still get people that way. The Boundary Waters and typically outdoor pursuits and wilderness areas in general are not the most friendly, or perceived as not the most friendly environment for people of color and people of different backgrounds. So we started a diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice grant program where, instead of us leading trips, we help to fund trips that are organized by organizations that are already doing really good work on this front. It'd be very presumptuous of us to come in and say, like, yes, we are going to lead a BIPOC trip with our very homogenous staff who come from all a very similar background. So we've helped to fund organizations like Boys in the Woods, the Korokoro Project. We've helped just independently. There was a queer trip organized by Ely Outfitting Company, and that's that bottom photo. Brett Albin at a charter school in Minneapolis every year organizes a canoe trip and then a winter trip with YMCA Camp Minojan, where she takes her students out to go experience these wild spaces. And so just by funding people and trying to have a little bit of an easier access, is really important for our organization. And we don't always have capacity to organize these. We are pretty dedicated on our one very specific issue as a single issue campaign. But, if we don't promote getting people into the wilderness, then the next generation won't have any stake in it, and they won't be as inclined to want to step in and protect wildlands across the country. So, the more we can get people outside, the more we're helping ourselves in a way to continue on this legacy of love and protection for our wild spaces. Another thing we do on a more community level is we try to foster community connections and compassion, because, as Northern Minnesota, a lot of Scandinavian, Finnish people, Norwegian people, like it's a very Northern Minnesota culture. And sometimes when visitors come in, it is very intimidating for local peoples to not know, how to talk, how to act, how to communicate without it being like this awkward struggle. And so a lot of what we try to do too is like foster compassion and communication amongst a multitude of people. So one of the photos here, Dudley Edmondson, who is an award-winning photographer, writer, and birder, came up and gave a presentation, and it was really cute because he really talked about racism in the outdoors. And, a lot of people in that room had never confronted that fact that, wild spaces in many ways are inherently racist. And so as a community that is 100% built on outdoor pursuits, how can we try to come back from that and provide a welcoming, enticing, and opening space to people who have been pushed out of and off of these lands. We also, through Boundary Waters Connect and other organizations, do like new resident socials and ways for, the younger population who may have just moved to Ely to connect with, community elders, so to speak, who have lived in Ely for many years and really know the region and life here. So that's a big part too of how we're trying to break down these barriers. And Of course, barrier reduction is so hard. One of the most impactful things I think I ever heard on one of my trips was with this group from Big City Mountaineers, which is a phenomenal program. If you haven't heard of them, they get urban youth out into wild spaces across the country. And one of the places that they do a lot of their trips is here in the Boundary Waters in the Northland. Um, One of them said to me at the end of the trip, like, I was expecting there to be like a boogeyman or like someone mean behind every single tree the first couple of days, just waiting to tell me to get out of here. Like the first days they were so on edge, not feeling like they were welcome in this wilderness. And then, as they spent more time, they got more and more comfortable and just really felt at home here. And so I think even just by providing like ways for people to get involved, providing connections and communication about like, yeah, these organizations will help get you in the woods. That's super important. And like I said, the best way to ensure that our public lands stay loved and protected is to create easier access and reduce barriers to entry for those who have been historically shut out or forced out from these lands. So, the more we can get people outdoors, the more we can continue to thrive and enjoy the outdoors and know that when we move along, there will be people behind us that'll step in and still love this place. All right, so that was the bulk of the presentation. I'll talk just a little bit about how to get involved with our campaign if you would like. And then if there's any questions, we can chit chat about those. So the first thing I always urge people to do is sign up for our emails and newsletters. If you want to stay connected, if you want to stay involved, if you want to get action alerts or hear about events happening virtually and in person near you, like sign up for emails and newsletters. That's the best way to really, hear from us. Another way, I always am a huge supporter of volunteering time. If you can't volunteer, or if you can't support us through money, volunteering is honestly so helpful. As someone who leads a pretty good team of volunteers across the Northland, it's so nice to be able to have people who can help us out when we need it for events. So become a volunteer or become an ambassador if you're tuning in from outside of Minnesota or tuning in from inside of Minnesota and want to take a little bit more claim on this movement by organizing your own team of volunteers wherever that might be. So that's always super helpful. If you are a kid or have a kid or know a young person that would like to fly in to Washington, D.C. when we do our next fly-in, definitely you can email me for more info and I'll get you in the loop on that. But I was a Kids for the Boundary Waters kid back in 2018. I was 20 at the time, I believe. So I was not a kid by any means, but it's such a phenomenal opportunity to really get engaged and involved in politics and wilderness lobbying and protection in a very deep and fun way. Of course, you can always donate. Donating money is very helpful. That helps pay for a lot of the work that we do and I do. And some other ways that you can help us right now is to urge your federal and state senators and representatives to support our various bills. We have bills at both level. On the federal level, Betty McCollum, Representative Betty McCollum and Senator Tina Smith are our champions. At the state level, State Representative Sandra Feist and State Senator Kelly Morrison are our champions. So super important to just reach out to your elected officials and ask them to support our bills. And the final way that you can help our movement is tell your friends and families about us. It can be a quick mention like, yeah, there's this cool organization called Save the Boundary Waters that's trying to save the boundary waters. The more that we can kind of connect with people across the country and especially within Minnesota to share what's going on is always super important. So with that, here's my contact info if you would ever like to reach out to me. Otherwise, feel free to visit savetheboundarywaters.org, where you can also find my contact info as well as other staff members' contact info. And does anybody have any questions?
Thank you so much, Maddie. Really appreciate everything you said and sharing your personal story and your passion. It's very infectious. So really thank you for your time. Yeah, if folks have questions, they want to pop in the chat, or if they want to audibly say them, I guess, on mute, you're more than welcome to. Just a question right off the bat to get us going here. I know you've mentioned your involvement in youth work and your passions about getting youth out in the wild. I'm just wondering, the way that things are going, at least due to COVID and other things, it seems like a lot of kids are, I guess, for lack of a better term, becoming more indoor kids and have some other maybe new barriers that we haven't had before. So I'm just wondering, how do you in your time working with youth, how do you navigate those barriers and how do you get kids excited about the wilderness?
Yeah, I'll start off first. You know, a lot of the folks that I've guided like are already kind of on the hook, so to speak. They're traveling to me to visit the Boundary Waters. So, you know, some of that work is already done. They've already expressed interest, or maybe their parents have forced them to express interest by physically traveling to the camp and coming on a trip with me. But I think my favorite part is, you know, cell phones. Leaving cell phones behind is so scary. I remember when I was 15 and I did my first trip, you know, back in 2014. So I am Gen Z. For people who may be wondering, I just remember being like, oh God, how will I survive without my cell phone for 10 days? Um, and sorry, somebody just walked in to come visit. So it was a pretty intense experience for me. And I see that with kids all the time, where like the first 2 days, they're just like craving their phone, and it's really hard to get them to stop thinking about like what might be happening on Instagram and who might be texting them and who might be like sending them snaps. Or, you know, most often kids are like, I'm losing my snap streak, oh God. uh, so it's tough, but then beyond the first couple of days they usually loosen up and really come to appreciate and understand like this is a really rare experience and wilderness is pretty awesome, and it's okay to just take a break from your cell phone for a couple of days. Now, in reference to getting kids passionate about the outdoors now, God, it's hard. And two, I think I have always lived and been blessed and privileged to live in incredibly, you know, rich environments. I grew up in the mountains of Colorado, and so just stepping out on my back porch, I was essentially in the forest. And I know that's not the case for everyone currently. And when we look at a lot of the urban areas that have been built in modern times, you know, of course, kids don't want to go outside. It's like an asphalt, car-ridden jungle of just like non-natural objects. So I think getting kids invested and involved in the outdoors is really difficult. And that's where sometimes social media is important to acknowledge, you know, big TikTokers like Alex Harus and other people who really glorify going outside. That hopefully gives the younger generation a little bit of an incentive to explore. You know, so social media is both amazing and also both really, really horrible. It just really depends on the context we're using it. But, you know, having schools and other groups really advocate like just getting people to go paddle on Lake Nokomis for a day and like see what that is like is just really good baby steps into going on a 10-day wilderness trip, for example. You know, Brett Albin and Big City Mountaineers, they do that with their students. They do like a baby overnighter in Minneapolis so the kids can have an opportunity to see what it's like before committing hard to, you know, a 5 or 6 day trip. Like that's incredibly intimidating if you've never spent a night camping before. So yeah, getting kids outdoors is hard, especially in this post-pandemic world. But I do think there are people and organizations really putting in that effort to get more children involved and invested in outdoor spaces.
Awesome, thanks. Sarah has a question. Does your organization ever partner with local health systems or health departments?
Ooh, that is a wonderful question. I think not necessarily. I'd have to look through our business coalition to see if there are any public health institutions that are with us on that coalition. But from my understanding, a lot of our partnerships are with more traditional, you know, like businesses that are serving the Boundary Waters, or, you know, natural resources businesses, Patagonia, Oboes, Keen, folks like those who are like very invested in natural spaces. But I would have to look into that for you and see if we do have those partnerships.
Great.
Yes.
Oh, go ahead, Mary.
Hi, hi everyone. I'm Mary Grand, and I just wanted to add a comment to your great presentation, Maddie. I this was a number of years ago, and this relates to the healthcare partnerships. I was a volunteer at Hennepin HCMC, Hennepin County Medical Center, in a program that was for youth with weight management, healthy eating program. And for 5 years, we did a partnership trip with Wilderness Inquiry. I'm sure familiar with them. And it was the coolest thing to see these urban youth who would not otherwise have the opportunity to get into the bend. We would go to the headwaters of the Mississippi, so not fully in, but I just wanted to share one of the comments from a kid once that I will never forget is he could not believe how quiet it was. And for, even one kid to get that experience for, it was a 4-day, 3-night trip that we would do every year. Very cool. So I just wanted to say thank you for all the work that you're doing, not only to protect the environment, but to also, bring the next generations into it.
Thank you. You can't have wilderness without the next generation who wants to protect it.
Awesome. Thanks for that comment, Mary. That was really special. Kim has a question for you. I get that you want to expand access to people who haven't typically been there, but is there a concern about overuse, overpopulating the route and degrading the land? We go every year and have noticed a huge increase in numbers, harder to grab a campsite.
Oh yeah, that is absolutely a great question. And yeah, that's, I think, the struggle that we're really coming to within the outdoor industry as a whole. So, people who have been going there for years and years and years, who love it for its wilderness aspect, are starting to notice that there's more people. And I think it's both something to celebrate that there's more people coming up. But in the case of 2020 and 2021, when we were seeing about 225,000 visitors, there was a lot of degradation going on, and a lot of people who weren't fully versed in understanding wilderness travel and wilderness ethics and leave no trace. And, even I think the Forest Service permitting system, which last year in 2022, they reduced the number of permits for the boundary waters to kind of accommodate that. It's really difficult. And I think, we want to promote more people going out into these spaces. We also still want to make sure we're not pushing out traditional users. So we're really at this tough impasse of trying to figure out that next step. And I think that's what the Forest Service is currently working on, is coming up with a system or a plan to ensure equitable access to the wilderness while still maintaining and protecting the resource we have. I would also recommend, if you ever have a chance, go to the Quetico. The Quetico is great up in Canada. That's always my next step and next recommendation to people who are looking for a more, like 90s era boundary waters aesthetic, is go up into the Quetico and try your hand there, because it's really cool and it's really empty. Back to your question though about, resource preservation and trying to find this balance. It's tough. And I think if we try to approach looking at the boundary waters in this, abundance mindset, there's been a lot of call for that recently. Instead of worrying about, like, oh, I didn't get this permit, or, oh gosh, I need to get this permit early because then other people are going to push me out of this beloved wilderness. I think trying to view it more as like a shared communal resource is really important. Like, we're all trying to share this wilderness. And if we can try to allow more people to come up, that's extremely important. And if we can, help educate them to understand how to travel ethically and responsibly in the wilderness, that might lead to a little bit less degradation, even if there are still a lot of people. And I anticipate the boundary waters will probably be at capacity again this summer, as it has been the last couple of years. But how wonderful to have more people coming up there, and how wonderful it could be if we all have an opportunity to make sure we're providing education and resources for visitors to ensure we're not degrading it more than it already is being impacted. So I hope that answered your question.
That's such a beautiful mindset. I appreciate that. Absolutely. So it looks like we have about 8 minutes left. So I'll just do our little goodbye spiel. Unless anybody else has any questions, I'll give you about 10 seconds. Okay. Yep. Kim says, I appreciate that answer. That's great. Great. Okay. Well, we will hope to get folks out on time is always the mission. And I'm not going to share my screen not going to do full slides because my computer will shut down. So just wanted to say thank you all for being here. Really appreciate your time. If you enjoyed this and want to stay connected to us, become a member at mpha.net. That's a great way to keep track of all of the good stuff we're doing here. We have a couple awesome things coming up. We have our policy forum series. So they've been doing injury prevention, and this series is at this point we're doing on the move. So different ways of transportation and whatnot. So that takes place at the New Brighton Community Center on May 12th in the morning. We also have our annual conference, which we've hopefully everybody knows all about this and is hearing all about this because it's really exciting. Our theme this year is raising the public's health, becoming better ancestors through history, hope, and action. We have 4 great plenary speakers and a lot of other great work being that will be broadcast at this conference. So please, please, please do show up and sign up. We have, it's in person at Concordia College in Moorhead, but we do have a virtual option. So there are ways to get involved and we'd love to see you there. And you can register for both of those at mpha.net as well. Also, if you're interested in other kind of more on the business side of things, we have different committees going on. So we have the policy and advocacy, health equity, and the conference planning committee. They all meet at these varying times. And lastly, follow us on social media if you're interested in keeping up with what we're up to at Minnesota Public Health. And other than that, thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. And thank you so much, Maddie, for your time and your beautiful presentation. And I hope you all have a great rest of your Wednesday.
Hey, thank you all so much. Have a good one.
All right, thanks.